Thank you very much, Melissa. That was a very generous introduction. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak to such an audience. And I know the future is, I really strongly believe that the future is in data. So all of you, I'm sure, are creating the future of finance as we go along. So with me is my colleague Parsa. So we'll split the session in this way. So I'll speak about communication surveillance. That's the focus of the topic today. For about 10 minutes, set you the context and the use case and what we're going to show. And Parsa will walk you through a bit more detailed even demonstration, and potentially we would have a bit of time to do Q&A. So if you could quickly go to the next slide. So I think Melissa already introduced ourselves. So maybe just one small point to add is we also work with, as a part of our business, since we specialize within banking and insurance, we also work with quite a lot of what we call as RegTechs and FinTechs, one of the leading ones in the industry, in order to even implement some of these things that I'm talking about. So one such demo, one such FinTech is also something that we'll share with you as a part of the demonstration itself. So if we can go quickly to the next slide. In terms of data, we do quite a bit. So, but the focus for today is going to be on communication surveillance. Within communication, we will spend a bit more time on voice, because I believe it's a bit more interesting space than the other e-communication space, because voice has its own complexities that we need to deal with. And probably for the future, I'm sure there are other sessions that are happening in the financial crime space, and I would even encourage you to, if there is no specific session, and encourage you to also read up or look into the topic of network analytics. This is quite trending in the area of financial crime, because although AI machine learning can solve quite a bit of problems in the financial crime space, financial crime happens within networks, and it's quite an interesting concept on how some of the players have used network analytics to solve the problem. But the focus for today is not that, it's communication surveillance. And I'll quickly dive into what communication surveillance really means and what is the use case that we are talking about. Right, so if we can quickly go to the next slide. So even before we go through the deck, so the context of this is we implemented automated communication surveillance as a part of a private banking setup. And within private banks, the use case that we are going to show to you is around order taking investment suitability. Or you can, for Europe, you can consider some comparable thing as MiFID. And the idea is that there are so many things that needs to happen as a part of the sales process. And the front office is expected to carry out certain disclosures, due diligence, and so on in their conversation with the client. Question is, how can we actually detect it a lot more effectively? Can we automate parts of it? Can we automate it fully? And how do we really bring in efficiencies? So this is the use case on the POC that we actually did with one of the private banks, was also quite successful. We hit a success rate of, depending on the language, sometime even close to 70–80% of detecting most of the things. And we'll show through a bit more, we'll do a rundown on the demo itself to show you what this really means, right? So in a typical private banking setup, what you would have is you'll have the order, a trade that needs to be placed. In this case, maybe a simple share. Question is, what has led into this particular discussion, right? So there are multiple channels. Some of them are e-communication, could be emails, could be chats, could be certain things which are a bit more documented or written, or it could also be through voice. For example, there could have been a discussion. If you can click the next slide. So for example, the client would have called the RM asking about certain opportunities where you know that this is not a solicited, but rather also client initiated transaction. Then there could have been other discussions around chats. Chats, it's also a bit of an interesting topic where many of the institutions are going towards even using their corporate side of chats in order to even monitor what's happening through these chat applications. And this is not trade relevant, right? And this discussion that initiated could have happened days before. And then there are multiple other things that has happened. And ultimately, maybe there was even a face-to-face meeting that happened, as a part of which there was a call report that was filed that the RM met the client. And if we can continue further. So the question is, how do you determine which are the communication relevant to the trade, right? So typically in a banking setup, you would have an analyst sitting on the phone or trying to figure out what happened actually with regards to a specific order or specific trade, where the right things actually being done, right things being disclosed, and so on. So the first pain itself is, how do you even know which is actually the call or which is actually the documentation to look into? So that's one piece of the puzzle that we try to solve with this automation on the communication surveillance side. And if we can go to the next part of the puzzle, which is, when was the disclosure made? Was it made before the trade within that particular context of that specific product? Or was it a completely unrelated disclosure? So it's also the time frame and the timeline that needs to be reconstructed when it comes to that specific order of the trade. And the last one is, was the disclosure adequate, right? So it could be with regards to the simple things like order quantity and strike price and things that you would have as a part of the trade. It could also be to do with certain complex risk disclosures that you need to make on specific instruments, products, mismatches, and so on, right? So the idea is that we try to automate as much as possible. So if we can go to the next slide. So there is an entire value chain that follows towards automation. So which means first part is review the trading and communication data, connecting the dots. The other one is identifying positive hits, which are those cases that you actually can and should look into. And then you reconstruct these scenarios then for somebody to investigate whether the right thing has happened or not, because not every single time communication is available, right? So there are certain things where there may not be adequate documentation, or it's not done over a tape line. And there might be times where you have to approach the front office to understand what really happened. This means it still will require a human being in order to do it, but we try to make the process as efficient as possible. So the next point is around take action to clarify, escalate, or resolve. And the final part is more around documenting, archival, and so on. So what we did for the first two things is we automate it from a systematic standpoint. And the next three phases, we implemented a platform that assists the performance of these tasks. So these typically could be case management related activities, workflow management, enabling discussions within the person who's performing the controls and the front office, and so on. So the idea was for us to be able to automate and bring efficiency to the entire process. And we've actually achieved quite considerable results in terms of even the POC that was done, even close to 50% efficiencies. In certain cases, the detection rate actually goes quite significantly high. Of course, it also depends on the language and the complexity around languages, because Asian languages sometimes tend to be a bit more complex. But we have managed to reach quite a reasonable amount of accuracy when it comes to detection itself. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So how do we do this, right? So of course, you have the unstructured data, which is on voice, emails, chats, and so on. And then you have to link it to the structured data. So which means either the trade, the client, the product, the RM, and so on. And then you have the third piece, which is banks policies. So banks policies could be anything and everything. It could be, in this case, we are going to show you something around mis-selling, which is suitability. It could be around product disclosures. It could be around other activities that from a banking standpoint that you would want to do a surveillance on in an automated way. And the way that we do it is we process the communication. And then we process, once the communication part of it, which is the voice and the comms part of it is put in a shape and form, then we analyze and tag the data. I'll go through in terms of how we actually do it in the subsequent slides. And then once we have data and the tagging and everything done in a reasonable way, then we apply NLP to see how exactly do you detect the adequate or detect the risks that you actually need to want to look into, right? So one is the first part of it is the monitored behavior, and second is what is the risks that you want to look into. Then you have positive hits, which is identified behaviors that are not in line with the stated policies. And then you would have the negative hits, which is not flagged events that are in line with stated policies. So there are cases where there are most of the banks actually do sample checks today. This means they pick based on a specific logic, maybe 100 samples a specific month. And then they look into these 100 samples, and then they say 80% seem to have followed, 20% does not follow, right? So with this kind of an automation and a platform, you can actually do it the other way around, which means you can do an entire sweep of all the things that are happening within the bank, and you can pick and you can use a risk-based approach in even picking the samples, right? So from a risk management standpoint, it's quite a quite a few steps ahead in terms of how you could potentially use such automation towards doing your surveillance, which means moving from a sample check towards a full holistic surveillance and going towards a bit more risk-based approach. All the things on the act is something that Parsa will try to touch on as a part of the system demo that we show, because it's just not the analytics part of it, but you would typically also need a platform for you to be able to complete the rest of the activities when it comes to case management and so on. So that's more or less the conceptual side. Now, if we go a bit deeper into what this really means in terms of speech analytics, so the slide actually talks about a series of steps, right? First is the audio. This challenge actually starts with the audio itself, because not all the time do banks have stereo or really high quality recording. So the challenges already start with audio. This means even if you get a transcription, maybe 60-70% accurate, in the next subsequent steps, you have to find a way of how do you actually make it better when it comes to automation. So challenge already starts off with the audio side of things. Then, of course, you have the convert phonetics to word levels. This includes everything, even language detection. One of the things that we have more recently even worked towards is how do you even detect mixed languages, because accents and different languages are one challenges to it, but you even have sometimes mixed languages that are being used. So how do you develop models and build models around mixed languages? So one is then the audio, then converting it into the phonetics to word models or word levels. Then the third one is dictionary based. So when it comes to dictionary based, this means if somebody says, I don't know, a Credit Suisse or a Julius Baer or an UBS, you need to be able to relate it to a bank, to an entity. So there are specific dictionaries and things that are defined that allows the system to recognize what is being said in order to read the context a bit better. So that would be, say, dictionary based text. The other one is domain level of phrase pack model. What is a domain level phrase pack model? Because you already have a weaker starting point when it comes to audio. This means you have to really find a way to improve. And how you do it using domain models is financial services itself. There would be typical jargons or words that you would use when you talk finance. When you talk trading, maybe it's a strike price, it's calls, puts, maybe there are different ways by which you speak when it comes to financial jargon. And one of the most important components that we have within the solution is very specific financial services related jargon, because to me, in order to raise or increase the accuracy towards what you're detecting, you have to put things in perspective, put things into the context. And the second last one is around output level. So when it comes, the other one is how do you really generate the output? So there are several models that we run to determine using probability. For example, if you see the web at the top, the sentence that you want to catch is "no one will catch me." But as people speak, there could be variations of no to a now. There could be variations of catch to a touch. And you would also need to understand the context of the sentence. So this means for every single word, we apply probability towards what could be possible permutations of word. And given the sentence, what is the word that it could, what is the real word that it could actually stand for? Because not all the time people speak clearly, not all the time we are able to detect exactly the right words, right? So for us, the idea is to use really then probabilistic model based on the entire sentence, based on the context of the discussion to really throw out what we believe is the right kind of sentence in that specific context. Once the entire piece is done, then we look into, of course, AI and machine learning. Then we apply the policies towards what is the risks, what are the things that we're trying to detect. And that's the final step when it comes to application of policies itself. So it's rather intricate. And to me, I'm not sure if time will do justice. So I'll pause here, and probably there is a bit more answers that you will get as a part of the demo that Parsa is going to share. So I'll quickly go on mute and let Parsa go with the demo.
Thank you, Prasanna. Allow me to share my screen with the demo environment. I hope Everyone can see my screen and hear my audio as well. Okay. Thank you, Prasanna. As he was mentioning, what we're going to cover right now is just a quick introduction of one of the ecosystem partners that we've worked closely with and implemented the automated communication surveillance with. So typically, in every bank, there are usually a team of analysts that are in charge of, from a risk management perspective, are in charge of running certain controls within the wealth management business. In these controls, they need to look into certain documentations, voice logs, and so on and so forth to connect them to certain trades and instructions that were received from the client to make sure that the instructions were executed exactly according to what was agreed with the client, and all the necessary disclosures were done. Now, one of the key pain points that majority of the banks have is with the growing trading volume, especially post-pandemic, the volumes are exponentially going higher, and doing all of these things manually is becoming more and more challenging. So what we see over here is just an example of how this can look like. Any given analyst in those risk management in those controls teams are facing a ton of data from a voice, email, all sorts of communications. Now, imagine for the purpose of this demo, which is going to be relatively short, we are going to look into one of these conversations that are happening between a client and a relationship manager discussing a sale of a financial product. Over here, just also a disclosure that this is just a reenacted voice log. This is not real data, so all the account numbers and names and all these things that you hear are all hypothetical. This is not a real call. But we just for the illustration purposes, we just kind of go through them very quickly. Typically, these conversations between clients and relationship managers can last more than 20, 30 minutes, or even sometimes more than an hour. And this makes it even more challenging for the control execution team to figure out which part of the conversation is it that they should be focusing on. Because most of the time they are forced to, and therefore most of the times they're forced to just listen to the entire tape. 1 hour of conversation, which might be, some parts of it may be trade relevance, the other parts of it may be talking about golf and other activities. So it's quite a challenge to pinpoint which part they should be looking at, and hence there's a lot of inefficiency. What we do over here is we try to pinpoint exactly which part of the conversation, what disclosure was made. And this is just for demo purposes. In theory, we can automate it completely. Knowing what the account number, for example, is, I can look at, so the blue bar over here that you're looking at is representing the entire conversation, and this part of the conversation is exactly when they talk about the account. I'm just going to play it very quickly. Hopefully you guys can hear it as well.
Account 123456. ISIN is S.
So this is the account number, for example. If I want to see whether the order was a market order or a limit order, I can just click on market order, and I know exactly which part of the conversation, again, this was discussed.
At market price, validity today, and expiration is also today.
So without going into too much detail, these are just a few examples that enables us, and everything that you see on the left-hand side is what Prasanna was mentioning, it was referring to as policies. These are all the things that we have developed based on, so the environment, the ecosystem partners have provided the environment for us. We have applied the private banking relevant terminologies and banks policies to this platform to be able to exactly identify what sort of disclosures we're looking for. And this is not only voice, it can also go to e-communication channels and so many more applications as well. And so developing all these policies are all dependent on all the artificial intelligence and machine learning concepts that Prasanna was mentioning before. That how do I define this policy is, in a very layman term, is for example, if I'm looking for a buy or a sell, I define this policy to say, if you hear the word buy or sell or want or get rid of, or these sort of words, then I identify that as a buy or a sell initiative. that is just one example of how the application of this looks like in the real world, but this goes far beyond just control execution and tape listening. You can essentially look at this as a giant Google search engine on your entire communications. So this means that if I want to pinpoint communications from one particular RM to a particular client, and if I want to look at which key phrases they were looking for, I can just pinpoint it and just narrow down the filter and look at all the communication between those individuals. Or if I just want to know who have been talking about RCNs recently, I can immediately figure out who have been talking about RCN. At the same time, we can leverage on data analytics and we can run statistical analysis on them, which the implications of it goes beyond risk management and looks at sales. So for example, we can look at in the past 1 month, which products were talked about the most by all of our clients or within a particular segment. Or another application of it is client complaint handling. Understanding that, for example, typically, if a risk manager wants to know what are the key areas in terms of services that they provide to the clients that needs to improve, usually they need to hire a team of consultants, auditors, and so on and so forth to review what went wrong. Doing interviews and all these things, which is not exactly accurate. But if you are able to run such data analytics on all of your communications, you don't even need to ask anyone. You can just run all of these statistical analysis to understand, for example, under the team Hong Kong, and talking about talking about client onboarding in the past 6 months, which RMs have had the most negative, because we can also do sentiment searches over here as well. We can see which relationship managers have had the most negative conversation with their clients. And this obviously is really, as Prasanna was saying, it's a paradigm shift in the way we process data and we perform data-driven decision making. There is so much more that I can go on and on. Usually this demo for us, it takes about an hour to go through all the capabilities, but this was just a sneak peek in what this solution can do, and generally automated communication surveillance can do for financial institutions. With that, I think I am right on time, and I will pass it back to Prasanna and the audience if you have any questions for us. Thank you.